and welcome to this lecture, which is Module 1, on place-based policies and the just transition. My name is Martin Ferry, and today I'll explore how tailoring public policy to the specific features of different territories and communities can strengthen the participation, inclusion, and social fairness in sustainability transitions. This session draws on research undertaken within the DUST project, specifically the exploration of different factors, so community, policy, contextual, that influence citizen and community engagement in just transition measures, especially amongst less engaged communities. Let's begin this look at policy-related factors by defining what we mean by place-based policies. At their core, these policies are designed to respond to the unique characteristics of a given territory, so its economy, its environment, its social structure, and its culture. They represent a shift away from one-size-fits-all models towards policies that are tailored to local realities. There are three key elements that distinguish place-based approaches. First is context specificity, recognizing that different regions face distinct challenges and opportunities. For example, the transition in a coal mining region in Poland demands different policy tools from an island region such as Gotland in Sweden, where energy resilience is a central concern. Second principle is integration. So place-based policies seek to bring together economic, environmental, and social dimensions. They recognize that sustainable transitions are not just technological or industrial, but are deeply social. And third, multi-level governance and participation. This means involving cooperation across EU, national, regional, and local levels, while engaging citizens and communities directly in decision-making. So these three features make place-based policies highly relevant to the just transition, because achieving a fair and inclusive transition requires local legitimacy, trust, and ownership. This definition covers a range of policy types, from territorial just transition plans, which are supported by the European Union's funds, to national and regional plans and strategies that include transition-related themes and issues to varying degrees, and spatial plans at different administrative levels. We looked at examples of these types in our research. Our research identified three main policy factors that shape the extent and quality of participation of less engaged communities in transition processes, as shown in this slide. First, policy framing and narratives. So this means how problems are defined and whose perspectives dominate. Second is policy governance, the structures and institutions determining who is involved in decision-making. And third is policy targeting, how territories or communities are identified and mobilized for engagement in these policies. Let's explore each of these in turn. On this slide, I've put our first set of policy factors under the heading of frameworks. By this I mean the rules, guidelines, and principles that actors, particularly policymakers, employ to set a logic for interventions and to determine policy goals. Clearly, this has implications for the participation of communities in just transition policies. So, in terms of the formal regulations and guidelines that determine the rights to participate, but also in terms of how the transition challenge is defined and what specific policy goals are prioritised. Also important is the extent to which the overall transition narrative is meaningful or relevant to different communities. Overall, just transition requires framing policies to acknowledge the needs of affected communities and workers. So across Europe, a range of formal frameworks exist to promote participation. Examples here include the EU Partnership Principle, Germany's Citizen Participation Charter, and Sweden's Planning and Building Act. These frameworks mandate consultation and transparency. They require policymakers to inform the public, justify decisions, and allow comment. However, our research found that these frameworks often ensure only formal rights rather than substantive opportunities. Under the Just Transition Fund, for instance, There's no requirement to involve citizens directly in decision-making, only to describe how stakeholders were consulted. Participation thus risks becoming a processual or procedural point unless it's supported by practical mechanisms and resources to support genuine engagement and dialogue. Okay, this slide turns to policy framing and narratives. Policy framing refers to how the challenge of transition is conceptualised. In many cases, sustainability transitions are framed primarily as technical or sectoral issues, focused on innovation, renewable energy, or industrial modernisation. While these goals are essential, they tend to privilege expert knowledge and limit citizen or community input. In several of the cases we studied, policymakers interviewed tended to view citizens as lacking the technical expertise or knowledge needed to contribute meaningfully to the policy. As a result, participation was focused mainly on experts, unions, and business actors. There were some exceptions. For instance, the national programme in Groningen in the Netherlands had a more open and flexible approach to framing. This was born out of local distrust linked to gas extraction, and it set broad objectives, such as improving livability, supporting well-being. And this invited communities to interpret these issues locally. This flexibility allowed genuine dialogue and showed that how we frame a policy fundamentally determines who can participate. Turning now to governance arrangements, this means the systems, the structures that are put in place to determine responsibilities for designing and implementing transition policies. These obviously greatly influence participation. In principle, multi-level governance should foster cooperation across public, private and community sectors. And multi-level governance supports community participation by emphasising collective or joint problem solving and power sharing across different levels and different types of actor. This governance approach, as you'll see in this slide, has three main dimensions. First, it includes elements of decentralisation. It allocates important governance roles to regional and local governments and their partners to strengthen bottom-up contributions. Second, multi-level governance depends on coordination. There should be clear pathways of dialogue and information exchange between government levels and with communities. Third, it often requires capacity building efforts to make sure that local authorities and communities are equipped to play meaningful governance roles. Turning to decentralised governance, our research found some notable examples where multi-level governance systems facilitated local bottom-up participation. Germany offers an instructive example in this case. In the Rhenish Lignite district, the so-called Future Agency helped organise dialogues and ensured that local voices influenced implementation, bringing together regional, municipal and local stakeholders. In Lusatia, youth committees helped engage young people in shaping the region's future. And in Silesia, we noted several examples where the regional government created structures to ensure strong mobilisation and participation of local authorities and communities. But we also found centralised systems, where participation was much more limited. In several cases, ministries retained control and local authorities felt that their involvement was constrained. I've included a quote in this slide from a frustrated regional government official that we interviewed. He said, "Meetings are held, workshops are done, deliberations are welcomed, but the real cards shall only be played by the national government." This shows that decentralisation and power sharing are vital for authentic community participation. If we look now at coordination and collaboration, this is another key governance factor for participation. Effective multi-level governance can facilitate the coordination of policies and actors and help to create arenas to reconcile competing interests and values, including those interests that come from less engaged communities. This again has different dimensions and associated challenges. First, transitions span energy, environment, jobs, and spatial planning. These issues are often managed separately in different ministries or departments, The operation of what we call sectoral silos risks fragmentation and complication, and this can create challenges for developing participatory spaces that draw together these issues in a specific territory or a community. Second, as I've already mentioned, a lack of coordination between local, regional and higher level governments can mean that bottom-up outcomes of participatory processes, so the priorities of communities, these may not be fully considered at higher levels, including at the national level. Third, coordination between public authorities and third sector or community organisations is also crucial. Civil society organisations can form an important bridge between public authorities and communities. Some will have their own networks that can be built on. But equally, there is a risk of disconnection between different participatory processes that are organised in the public sphere and others that are organised in the civil society sphere. Turning now to capacity issues. Even with decentralised governance, participation often depends on local capacity. Organising participatory processes to reach out to communities in sustainable transition initiatives invariably takes time and effort and substantial resourcing to have a meaningful impact. Public authorities may lack resources, they may lack the skills, they may lack the experience to run inclusive participatory processes. Some territories will benefit from established traditions of collaboration and partnership, but this is often not the case. Policymakers may also have to reconcile the aim to reach out to less engaged communities and conduct meaningful participatory processes with time constraints, with the reality of meeting strict deadlines for policy delivery, to spend money and to meet specific targets. Our research identified some promising solutions, which I've set out on this slide, to fill these gaps and challenges. So, providing specific training in organising participation to public officials, including appropriate ring-fenced funding dedicated to participation in a policy's overall budget, and accessing capacity building platforms that exist at EU and national levels. As I've noted, coordination with civil society organisations and community leaders can also provide crucial bridging support. I'll turn now quickly to the issue of targeting specific territories and communities. Most policies that we studied targeted territories, such as coal regions or industrial sectors, but they did not always consider specific social groups. Less engaged communities, including women, youth, rural residents, were often targeted only indirectly. Some initiatives that we studied made progress during the implementation stage in this respect. In Gotland, meetings were adapted as the implementation was rolled out for parents and women to take part. In Groningen, outreach teams visited rural areas and schools. In Germany, participation increased as the policies moved into the implementation stage. Youth and community organisations became much more active. These examples show that inclusion evolves over time as trust and local ownership grows. In summary, place-based policies offer strong potential to make sustainability transitions more democratic and effective and inclusive. They provide a powerful framework for managing sustainable transitions in a fair and inclusive way by emphasising community participation. They succeed when participation is embedded in the policy-making process from the start, where it's supported by real capacity and where it's treated as a continuous, ongoing process rather than a single-stage consultation. However, in practice, several policy-related barriers persist. These are the technical framing of transition that sidelines community knowledge, centralised governance of transition policies that limits local agency, and fragmented coordination that helps or that contributes to limited capacity. Overall, I would argue that bridging the gap between the promise and the reality of place-based approaches to transition, between targeting and actually mobilising communities for participation, especially those that are most vulnerable to transition processes, and are least engaged in public life remains a critical challenge for just transition policy. Thank you very much for your attention.